Hello and welcome to another Pints with Jack Skype session. Today I'm joined by John DeRosa. John is the host of the Classical Theism podcast, which you can find at classicaltheism.com. And on his podcast, he interviews wonderful guests like Dr. Brian Cross, Joe Heschmeyer, who's also been on our show, one of my personal heroes, Dr. Lawrence Feingold. And the quality of guests that he has is incredible. And every now and again, he scrapes the bottom of the barrel. He once had on this guy from this podcast you might have heard of called Pints with Jack. That aside, his guests are superb. But more recently, John has published a book called One Less God Than You, How to Answer the Slogans, Cliches, and Fallacies that Atheists Use to Challenge Your Faith. John, welcome to the show.
David, thank you so much for having me on. I'm a big fan and happy to be here.
Well, it's wonderful to reconnect again. As I said in the intro, I came on your show to talk about surprise, surprise, C.S. Lewis. And so it's lovely to have you on a Skype session to talk about what you've been doing. So how did you get into apologetics in the first place? Because this isn't your full-time gig, right?
Right. So I'll give you the brief story, and if you want me to add more, I can. But I grew up Catholic. I was a cradle Catholic, but never delved really deeply into the reasons behind the faith, or never had a big intellectual understanding of it. You know, I prayed, I was told to go to church, I did all this stuff, and I did believe, and I felt I had some religious experience, but it wasn't super substantial, and it definitely wasn't intellectual. And then I went off to college, and I was hearing all these different objections to religion. There was an atheist, Christopher Hitchens. Obviously, people will have heard of him. He came to do a debate my freshman year on campus versus Frank Turek, a Christian. So I'm like, oh, man, what's going on with all this stuff? Christians debating atheists. Long story short, I give a lot of credit to our priest, Father Bill, because I heard that they had an apologetics group that they did once a week, and I didn't know what it meant. Are you apologizing the faith, and what does this mean? And I found out that they were going through a textbook by Dr. Peter Kreeft, and they would ask questions and learn about why we believe what we believe. As Catholics, talk about, well, why should we think God exists? Why follow Jesus? Why belong to the Catholic Church? And he ran a great group once a week. He also was a great pastoral teacher and helped us learn how to pray, how to go to Eucharistic adoration, things I still am learning and need to do better. But ultimately, through that group, I was sparked, I was interested, and then ever since then, I kind of just read and listened and followed things on the side because I wanted to know more. Once you get a little taste of it, you've probably felt this too, whether it's with C.S. Lewis, whether it's with an author you like. Once I got a little bit of taste of the intellectual side of Catholicism, I wanted to learn more so that I could share it with others. And then eventually, we'll talk about this, but I wrote this little book to help people do the same thing.
Wonderful. So how did you end up starting the Classical Theism podcast? Because I always find that people who end up doing podcasting, it's never just like a direct line. It's very rarely everybody's sitting down saying, you know what, I'm going to start a podcast. So how is it for you?
Yeah, that's a good point. Because I graduated college in 2012, and I had always loved podcasts myself. So although my friends, not all of them have heard of them, I was always someone who was like, oh, you got to listen to podcasts. You got to listen to this podcast. You got to listen. And I just personally love podcasts, learning to them. You could exercise to them, all different topics. And then, I was listening to one podcast one time, and the host actually encouraged people to start their own thing. And for at first I'm like, oh no, I could never do this. I could never do that. And then he was, explaining how to do it and what you could do. And he said you could start a blog, you could start a podcast. And eventually I just decided to do it. And I have a little link on my website. If anyone else is interested, it's not as hard as it looks, but you do want to plan ahead and you don't want to make all the mistakes that I made. So classicaltheism.com/start podcasting. I have like 8 tips of what I would have told myself, when I first started. But yeah, ultimately it was a person I was listening to who encouraged me, and also my love of podcasts. And I'm like, oh, shoot, wait, I don't have any degrees in this stuff, but I can bring on all these experts, philosophers, theologians, even lay people who have studied a particular issue, and then they can share important content with the listeners.
And then you get to look smart.
Yeah.
No, I love it. Okay, so then how did you move from podcasting to, being a real grown-up and being an author?
Yeah, so this is definitely right. Putting on my big boy pants here. But I'll tell you who encouraged me. I originally had an ebook I kept seeing all these slogans from the time I was in college until, even now. New atheists and skeptics online will throw out these one-liners, these biting remarks, these criticisms of religion that can just stop religious people in their tracks. And I had an ebook called Answering Atheist Slogans where I had about 10 of these, but it kept growing. Then it was 12 slogans. Then it was 13. Then it was 14. And then I had a friend, a Catholic, actually, Gary Machuda, who you probably heard of, who actually told me, he's like, John, why don't you just compile all these and publish it as a real book? So I'm like, you know what? That's a pretty good idea. So it was hard because I'd never written a book before. It forces you to consolidate and to really pull from the best sources. But I ended up getting 20 skeptical slogans that you might hear in conversation. Some are superficial, some are more serious. But my goal was just to show Catholic Christians how you can respond to these in conversations and how you don't have to be so nervous and you can have better conversations even if you don't know the perfect answer off the top of your head. So I really wanted to equip people that they didn't need to run away when they heard someone shouting a slogan or just even offering it at the Thanksgiving dinner table. You don't have to be scared. You don't have to run away. I'm going to train you with the right questions you can ask, some important principles, so that at least you can have a better conversation and hopefully share something more, give them something more to offer. No one's going to convert on the spot. When I was writing this book, I had that in the back of my mind, or I at least have thought about it more recently. People don't convert reading one Facebook comment. They don't convert instantly in one conversation. That's just not typically how the Lord works. Yet, I think a lot of Catholics don't share their faith or share the goodness about it because they're nervous that they're not going to, convert them instantly or that they're not going to succeed. And I think we have to kind of change our standards of success a bit and know that the Holy Spirit can work through us, even if it's in a small way, even if it's in offering someone something like, oh, I never thought about it in that way before. That could be a win. A win doesn't have to be knocking St. Paul off his horse on a conversion, though of course God can do that here and there. But I just wanted to show Catholics that they can, make some more progress and have better conversations with atheists and skeptics if they follow some of these guiding principles. And then I go through the 20 of them to try to give you, okay, this is the concrete situation. This is what you could say. And I invite readers because I don't know all this stuff. Trust me, I've had so many, I made so many mistakes and bad conversations. One of the things I do in the book is I invite readers, try this out, and then maybe you'll come up with your own responses or your own questions, and you can kind of build your apologetics toolkit over time. As you know, our apologetics and evangelization, it's always developing because we start out as infants in the faith, and then we have to grow up, and we have to grow up and keep growing up with our relationship with God, and hopefully keep growing up with our apologetics as well.
Your comment about not necessarily having to knock it out of the park, the whole idea of planting a seed, it can seem cliche to say, but it's definitely true in my own spiritual journey, particularly in my return to the Catholic Church. I can think of just a couple of comments, very short comments that people had said to me that was kind of just like a stone in my shoe. It was something that bothered me, and I couldn't dispute the truth of the statement, and it was then thinking about it and unpacking it. I started to see things that I didn't before, and that I probably wouldn't have if they had gone at me, with a baseball bat.
Exactly. No, and I think that's just, we put so much pressure on ourselves to knock it out of the park. And I don't think people are, okay, let me put it this way. I just had a thought when you were saying that. Someone might be really good at knocking things out of the park. Like, I have a couple friends who are like so quick on their feet with like what they say, with their jokes, and I'm just not like that. But my point is, you don't have to be like that in order to be a good evangelist or a chance to practice apologetics well. A lot of times just asking questions. That's one of the first principles I talk about. If you learn how to ask someone proper questions whenever possible, instead of making statements and trying to refute them right away, just ask questions and listen. And just by doing that, you have a much higher chance of winning the person over, or at least treating them well. And they're going to be like, oh, I guess not all religious people are, stupid idiots. And they might have a better conversation. And then maybe you have another conversation a month or two later, or maybe they run into someone else and slowly they can get pushed toward the faith. So let's lower the pressure. You don't have to knock it out of the park, but you also want to have some good things to say to stand up for your faith.
Okay, then. So how is your book structured? Is it simply going through each of these slogans? Are they grouped in any way?
Yeah, so we got the introduction where I give like 5 principles. I can run through those quickly if you want, but then I group them into popular slogans, which are things you hear all the time. Then there's the serious slogans, which are actually pointing to deep, arguments that atheists have made that are pretty philosophical and can get pretty intense. And Christians have grappled with them for a very long time, but they can be spouted as a slogan. Yet there's a rich tradition of how to deal with these. So those are the serious slogans. Then I have slogans related to faith and evidence, because it became a popular critique of new atheists and people on the internet just to criticize the notion of faith itself. Like, what is faith? It's blind. You people just believe this for wishful thinking and so forth. So I have slogans related to critiquing faith and talking about evidence. And then the final section is just miscellaneous things I've heard comedians say on Tonight shows, things I've seen in memes on Twitter. But ultimately, you got 20 slogans, and I try to use those first principles and walk you through what you could say in response when you hear them in conversation.
Okay, then. So I've got your table of contents. So let's look at one. How do you respond when someone says, "I'm not into religion. I believe in science"?
Yeah, no, a very popular sentiment these days. And I like the way you put it too. Like, I'm not into religion. I believe in science, because I think, again, Catholics are going to be nervous here. They're like, "Oh no, what do I say? What do I do?" Start with a question. Whenever possible, ask questions rather than make statements. The key idea here is, what's the incompatibility that you see between believing in God and believing in science? Or you might just say to the person, if they put it your way, why can't you be into both? Because I'm a Catholic and I love science. And then you can get to the deeper issue. But if you don't start with that question, if you just try to come up with 10 facts that are going to show this person that they're wrong, well, you're not going to have a good conversation, and you might not even answer their specific worry. So the first opening response I tell you to do is ask that question. What do you see is wrong with having both? Why can't you believe in God and science? And that puts it back on the other person. And then in the rest of that chapter, I give 5 of the most common issues that come up. Chances are it's going to be one of these 5. Do you know what I have as number 1? What do you think the number 1 issue is?
Evolution?
Yeah, that's it. Most of the people are going to say, well, evolution shows the Bible is wrong about creation. And that's where we have such a rich response as Catholics, because although the church doesn't mandate a particular view, ever since the recent popes, John Paul II, Pope Benedict, Pope Francis, the church has definitely shown openness to evolution. And we might say, well, I don't actually see an incompatibility there, because I think God could create human beings over a process of evolution. And the first chapters of Genesis, our catechism has held, and thinkers going all the way back to St. Augustine, the first chapters of Genesis contain figurative language that doesn't need to be taken literally. So would you be open to Christianity if you could also believe in evolution? And then pose that question to them and get them thinking. So that's how I would start, with belief in God and belief in science. The other ones I can talk about more, but I have some people will say there's no scientific evidence for God. Some people will say miracles are not possible according to science. Some people will say neuroscience has disproved the soul. And other people might say, well, most scientists are atheists, so we should be atheists. But if you know, and I give you a quick line on how to handle those, you know how to handle those 5 issues, I think you have a good chance of having a productive conversation.
And I really liked how you put it back as a question again. It's like, okay, if Christianity is like this, is that something that you could accept, or something you'll be more interested in? You mentioned Frank Turek earlier. There's a question I've often seen him ask when students come to him, and he says, if Christianity were true, would you become a Christian? Because he always makes the point that sometimes it's not a head issue, it's a will issue. It's like, I actually don't want it to be true. And simply asking the question can help us reassess our own motivations.
That's a great question. Yeah, no, I like that too, because it reorients us towards truth, and maybe it reveals to us that, oh man, I just don't like this, what I've been taught about this, and that's why I'm repulsed by it. But let's talk about why you don't like it. If I said, if Christianity were true, would you become a Christian? The person says no. My thing is, okay, why not? I want to know more. What has got you that way? And there might be a real deep personal harm, perhaps when they were growing up, that just pushed them completely away. And you don't get to that stuff if you don't ask questions. So put the bullhorns away, ask questions, listen, and then, like you said, try to offer it as something more. Well, would you have this? Have you considered this? What about this? And then you can go deeper. If you have a closer friend, it's going to be different, right?
Yeah.
You know, if this is a person you just meet, if it's someone on the street, if it's someone at a family party that you don't see very often, you may not be able to go as deep in that first conversation. Whereas if it's a closer friend, maybe you have an initial conversation and then maybe you are able to go deeper and peel back some of those layers into, hey, you know, can I pray for you? Is there anything I could do to make up for this? Because I think this terrible thing happened to you, and that's why you're really kind of repulsed by Catholicism. But I think God just loves you and wants you to come back for the church. And you might say something like that to a closer friend that you wouldn't say in an initial conversation with a random person. So you got to use your judgment as well.
Sure. Okay, so that last one was from the popular slogans section. What about one from the serious slogans? So what if someone said, okay, well, if this loving God of yours exists, surely his presence would be more obvious. How do you respond to that?
Yeah, so that's the first one in the serious slogans, and it gets at what's come to be known as the problem of divine hiddenness. If God's all good and he's all loving and he exists, shouldn't he be more obvious to us? And before you start launching into an answer, and I think there are a lot of good answers you can give, you want to ask the person questions. You might ask them, find out if this is the position they've always held. You know, did you always disbelieve in God? I'm just curious. Is this the reason that pushed you away? Or, hey, here's a good template question. Have you ever considered any of the Christian responses to divine hiddenness? And what did you think about them? You want to find out if this is just one thing that the person thought of, or if it's something that they've been researching for years. Because you got to handle those folks differently. Maybe this is something they've been grappling with, you know, for a long time, and they've looked into a bunch of answers and it's still not clicking. That's going to be a tougher situation, but maybe just someone who thought, you know, if God loved us, he would pop in and be right there, and he's not there, so, I don't believe him. So ask them, did you always believe in God? Or ask them, have you considered any of the Christian responses to this? What'd you think about that? Or here's another one, Pascal. These are all opening responses, and then I'll give you some more substance. I think Pascal has a line that God gives men enough light who want to find him, but he also gives them enough space so that if they don't want to find him, they won't. So you might offer that and say, hey, you know, I think this is a paraphrase. That's not a quote from Pascal, but you might say, hey, one time I heard someone say, you know, God gives people enough light so if they want to find him, they will, but he also gives them enough space so if they don't want to find him, they won't. And I think that's like a good initial statement. You could say, what do you think about that? And then that gives them a chance to reason a little bit more and think about it and maybe fine-tune their objection and go into it deeper. So those are all opening responses. I'll give you a little bit more meat here. Or what do you think about that? I could pause there for a second. I can keep going.
No, I think that's good. I think my initial question would be, what would you expect the world to look like if God made himself more obvious? Because I'm not quite sure what that would look like. It's to paraphrase Augustine, he said something along the lines of, if God, why is there evil? But if there's no God, why is there good? The many great things in life that I naturally feel gratitude for, I very quickly grow numb to feeling grateful for these things.
No, that's a good point. And so what I do next is I make like 6 bullet points and I put them in an acronym, but I'll just give you 2 here. The one that you just brought up, so the acronym is no.
Oh dear. Oh,
David, can you hear me?
Okay, you're back.
Sorry.
Okay, no worries.
Can you hear me now?
I can hear you great. Let's take it from when you talk about that. You in my book, I give a number of bullet points. I'll give you 2. The one that you did from there.
Great. So in my book, I give it a number of bullet points, about 6 bullet points, how to deal with this, like different suggestions. I'll just share 2 here because one of them relates to what you just said on what would you expect the world to look like. And the way I put it is like this. God being more obvious doesn't necessitate more proper relationships with him. In other words, just because God, suppose he were more obvious, that doesn't necessarily mean that more people would enter into proper relationship with him. What do I mean by that? Or how do I motivate this? I suggest you ask your friend a question, ask the person a question. do people ever choose to do what they know is wrong for them? Do people ever choose to do what they know is wrong for them? And a simple example is like eating unhealthy food. I think if you ask most people, they would know that they're supposed to eat healthy and exercise a certain number of days a week. Yet, like myself, they fail at this. They eat fast food. They choose the wrong thing, even though they know what they're supposed to do. So what I'm getting at is the mere knowledge that God exists wouldn't necessarily imply that the person is going to make the right choice to follow him. Perhaps, as you were kind of alluding to, people would grow to resent God in a world where he was always breathing down their necks, so to speak. Also, it might mitigate the chance for people to make real, true, genuine moral choices out of the goodness of their hearts rather than just out of the fear of this God who was breathing down their neck. So that's just one of the bullet points, that just because God is more obvious doesn't necessarily mean that more people are going to enter into a proper relationship. Some people might just resent him. But another bullet point I want to share is this. I don't think God is as hidden as some people make it sound. He's not as hidden as some people make it sound. And the way I like to motivate this point is to ask a question. If you're looking at the Mona Lisa, where's the painter? Picture the Mona Lisa for a second. That painting from Da Vinci. You're staring at that painting. Where's the painter? And they might be like, John, what are you talking about? The painter's dead. Nowhere there. Well, what are we getting at with this? You're looking at the Mona Lisa. Where's the painter? The painter is not an item in the painting. The painting is not the person in the painting. He's not over in the left corner. He's not underneath the canvas at the molecular level that we just can't see him. But the painter is the necessary creator and the necessary reason for there being a painting at all. If there weren't a painter, there wouldn't be a painting. Similarly, this painter must have something like an intellect and designing ability to produce a painting of this capability. And so what this does is it points to kind of two classic directions of reasoning to God, such that God is the necessary creator of reality that began to exist, however long ago, or even if you don't think the universe began to exist, if you want to argue in Aquinas' way, it rests on this necessary foundation that is God, and also the beauty and order that we witness in the world. You could talk about fine-tuning, you talk about other things. Those also point to a creator. So although we can't see him with our eyes, like we can't see the painter in Da Vinci's painting, we can still discern that he exists from those effects. So that's another bullet point to get on the table when talking about the problem of divine hiddenness.
As you were saying that, it reminded me of an image I actually just posted on the Pints with Jack Instagram page, which is a quotation from Letters to Malcolm, where Lewis says, "We may ignore, but we can nowhere evade the presence of God. The world is crowded with him. He walks everywhere incognito." And I think the point is very true. I was recently talking with someone who is falling away from faith, and I was giving him some of the classical arguments for the existence of God. And he said, well, how would I have ever survived? It doesn't really seem fair that God is relying upon you to give me these sophisticated philosophical arguments to prove that he exists. And I said that, by the by, that's kind of irrelevant. It's just like, here is some evidence, make of it what you will. But I said a lot of these arguments that I'm giving you, they're only just tightened up, more logically rigorous working out of things that I had thought about even as a teenager. I wouldn't have called it the Kalam cosmological argument. I wouldn't have called it the argument from morality. But there were various intuitions that I had when I looked up at the night sky and thinking about the nature of reality and realizing that there was a time when this was not. And what could have created such a thing like this? The intuition that there does appear to be a real right and a wrong. And it's just years later, as I dug into a little bit more theology and philosophy, that I found names for these arguments and rigorous reasoning to take you to a very clear conclusion that God exists and the attributes of him.
No, it's a great point. And I think one of the nice things about that point is it drives the person back to considering evidence. Perhaps they just thought they had this silver bullet, like, oh, God would just be more obvious, and he's not. But, well, hey, wait a minute. People have had these intuitions for millennia that God exists, and they fine-tune them into rich philosophical arguments. What do you think about these? And most are like, oh, I never thought about that before, or maybe they have a response, and then you're into another conversation. But I think that's a great point. I'll just add one final point on the hiddenness thing. I have a bullet point on experiencing God, And I draw upon the work of Dr. Michael Ray in his book on hiddenness, because he devotes a great chapter to talking about how anyone can experience God, but it doesn't require like wild and crazy visions and voices. People think like, oh, what do you think about when you think of experiencing God? They think of like, hearing these voices, or the sky parting, or the waters separating, and the Israelites walking through them. Like, okay, yes, there can be these special instances, but the ordinary way Christians and believers in God have always felt they experience him is through ordinary phenomena, daily phenomena, the mundane, but through the right cognitive lens. And it actually can be a sort of learned skill to learn how to pray to God, to think about God, and to talk to him. And you can experience him, that's what Dr. Ray argues, even if you never have some kind of paranormal activity, vision, or voice. And you can kind of learn in this. And this is the Christian tradition of prayer. And our catechism has some great stuff on this. The Bible, of course, talks about people relating to God in various ways. So you should always encourage a friend who's struggling with hiddenness. Encourage them, even if the prayers have to be conditional. I just want to encourage you. I think God, if he exists, is the greatest treasure, and I believe in him. And I think you should just at least give it a try. Pray, a few times a week. Talk to him. Ask him to help him reveal himself to you. Ask him to help you with various difficulties. Ask him to help forgive sins. Go for that, because you can have an experience of God that is not like the Damascus Road experience or something else. So I think there's something to be said for that, so people don't have unreasonable expectations as to what the religious life is like.
And that was definitely true for me when I was at university, when my faith was really starting to come alive. And I just remember one day I was looking back on the day, and I just felt like God had been with me that whole day. Mm-hmm. And it had begun in prayer at the chaplaincy. And it was just something that I can't quite communicate, that I felt had been with me the whole day. Years later, I would read The Practice of the Presence of God by Brother Lawrence. And it was definitely that idea of just being mindful of God through my day. And I was just kind of amazed at the difference that it made. Now, that's not a knock them down, drag them out kind of proof for the existence of God, but it's at least something to give somebody hope if they do actually want to experience God, to know that it is possible and that it might not be a Mount Sinai-like experience.
Right. No, I completely agree. And honestly, I take solace in that as well, because prayer is something I've always struggled with on and off. Sometimes I'm just like, what am I doing? I'm just kind of like sitting here for 15 minutes. My mind is all over the place. Oh, I forgot to pray yesterday. Oh, I didn't do these chores. And that's part of the Christian walk. But I think it's important for people to know. And maybe you can even share a saint like Saint Mother Teresa or Saint John of the Cross, who knowingly had these really dark and dry periods, yet still found such a deep relationship with God and reaching out to him. And it's just important that I think for people who are struggling with faith, it's just important that they don't give up, and they don't just say, oh, you know what, there's no way this could be true, and walk the other way. If they can keep that window open, they can keep that door open, whether through prayer or through conversations, there's definitely room for the Holy Spirit to work and grace to pour in. And they might surprise themselves in just waking up one day and having a strong faith. I know that's happened to me at different points in my life, and hopefully we could share that with others. But yeah, those are a few thoughts on the hiddenness objection. I go into much more things, and what I do at the end of each chapter, I'll just close with this, I link to other resources, because in this book, I can't give you everything that's ever been said about a topic, but I'll give you the main points, and then I'll link to, if you want to go further onto a particular slogan like hiddenness, I have some resources there for you.
Excellent. And there was one other thing that I wanted to say back at the first bullet point when you were talking about people making bad choices for themselves. It reminded me of something that Lewis said in Mere Christianity in his chapter about faith, because he said a lot of people think that to have faith means to believe something in spite of the evidence. He says, no, I'm not asking anybody to do that. If you, to the best of your knowledge and understanding, you think Christianity isn't true, I'm not asking you to believe it. He says, but if you do follow the evidence and do conclude that Christianity is true, I can promise you what's going to happen. There will come a point when your faith is going to become incredibly inconvenient for you. There's something you're going to want to do that your faith says that you shouldn't do. And he says it's at this point that your emotions will run a blitz on you. And you may then follow your emotions rather than what you had previously thought out and thought through and the evidence that you had followed. And you might just push all of that away because there's something that you really want that your faith tells you that you can't have. And I often compare it myself to when I went skydiving. I had done research on skydiving. I knew it was very safe. I checked the school. They had a very good record. But when it came to me standing on the edge of that doorway with the world a long way down, my reason wanted to run away. I didn't care how much I had checked. I was scared to death. And so sometimes faith is just holding on to the clear, rational, evidential process that has taken you up to that threshold. And it simply means following through in the direction that the evidence has pointed.
I think that's a great way to sum it up. That's in Letters to Malcolm.
It's in Mere Christianity, where he has 2 chapters on faith, and in one of them he talks about there are different meanings to the word faith, and he basically says that faith is holding on to the truth when your emotions are running a blitz on you.
That's a good definition, because it's resonant with the Catechism and what I think of in the Catholic tradition as well as the Christian tradition, that faith is like, it's a firm assent and conviction. It's not blind. It's not in spite of the evidence. It's not an arbitrary leap into the dark. It follows the evidence where it leads. But also when you get there, it's a firm trust and holding on to. And oh my gosh, that is so gripping. I love that example that you gave, because I think we all have those moments in our lives, whether it's friends asking us to do something, someone in our family asking us to do something, presented with a choice at work, and we know it's against our faith. And it just is very challenging. You know what? 21st century, it's only to get harder, right? As far as, the way the culture seems to be going. Mm-hmm. But if you stick with it, if you choose to activate that faith, you hold on to that, I think you're going to find that God gives you even more grace, and it could be cemented even further into your character, and you might even become a saint. So that's what I hope. I hope we need more Catholic saints that are going to hold true to it.
And it's particularly that virtue of fortitude, which Lewis said is every virtue at its testing point.
Mm.
It's when it would be much easier just to give in. And he even said that basically the sinful man doesn't really know about temptation because he gives into it too easily. He doesn't know what it would have been like in an hour or 2 hours if he had resisted. And he said, as a result, Christ was the only true realist because he endured all temptation but didn't sin.
Wow. I got to read more Lewis. That's what I'm getting out of this.
Everybody needs to read more Lewis.
Christianity and all that good stuff. This guy, oh man, David, thank you for sharing that. This is awesome.
Well, thank you for coming on the show. And once again, could you tell people where they can find out about your podcast and where they should buy the book?
So the podcast is classicaltheism.com, and you can find out all the episodes there. You can listen on any regular podcatcher. But the book, you can go to Amazon and search it, but I also have a direct link at classicaltheism.com/new book. And it's called One Less God Than You. If you hop on my email list, I got some special goodies, because when I wrote this book, they made me cut out a bunch of stuff and extra, because it's got to be a reasonable length. And I was writing like extra thousands of words on the Kalam argument, and they're like, no, we got to cut this down. So if you want to hop on the email list, I'll give you a chance to get that bonus material. I'll send you that PDF if people are interested. But thank you so much, David, for having me on. It's been a pleasure.
Not at all. As always, all of the links will be in the show notes, and please join us again next week. Cheers.